I was only a young man when it happened, barely old enough to be out on my own after dark. Yet I found myself walking the fog-covered streets of the city that night, my heart pounding with an unknown sense of dread. The world outside seemed muffled, almost as if the fog itself was swallowing every sound, every footstep, every whisper. It was late, later than I should have been out, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The tavern down the corner had been too inviting. Warm fire, laughter, strong ale, and it had kept me longer than I intended. My head buzzed from the drink, but my thoughts remained sharp, my senses alert, though not quite enough to avoid the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The city was dark, silent, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle, like something was wrong, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it. The streets were narrow, cobblestone roads winding through shadowed alleys, and the fog rolled in, thick, swirling in ghostly tendrils around the lampposts. It made the night feel alive. The lamps, dim and flickering, cast strange, long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The light barely cut through the mist, leaving the city drenched in an eerie, suffocating gloom. There was no moon tonight, only darkness, and it seemed to swallow everything in its grasp. I shouldn't have been out this late. I knew that. But something, perhaps the drink, or just the irresistible pull of the night, kept me walking. My boots clacked against the stones, the only sound in a city that felt almost too still. I tried to ignore the unease creeping over me, shaking my head and muttering to myself, "It's just the fog. It's just the drink." But the words sounded hollow, even as I said them. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had heard the whispers. Everyone had. Strange things had been happening recently. People had been talking about it in hushed tones at the tavern. Women going missing. Bodies turning up in the streets, discarded like trash. The city's pulse had quickened with fear, the tension thick in the air. But I thought they were just stories, rumors. People exaggerate when they're scared, after all. It wasn't until the smell hit me that I realized something was terribly wrong. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the typical stench of the city, wet stone, horses, the occasional rubbish heap. But then it hit me. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the smell wasn't of the city at all. It was something sharper, something metallic, the unmistakable scent of blood. My heart lurched in my chest and my feet froze to the cobblestones. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as the scent seemed to saturate the air. My breath hitched and my mind raced with thoughts of where it could be coming from. Had something happened? Was someone hurt? I glanced around, expecting to see something, someone, but the streets were deserted, the fog so thick that it seemed to mute the world itself. I was alone. The silence was unnerving. No cries for help, no sounds of footsteps, no distant shuffling that might indicate someone else nearby. The city felt completely still. And the smell, oh, the smell lingered in the air, heavy and thick, making my stomach churn with unease. It was then I noticed the faintest sound. A low, dragging noise. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my ears. But no, there it was again. Slow, deliberate. Something or someone was moving. I turned toward the sound. My instinct screamed at me to run, to turn around and get as far away from this place as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot. A voice in my head told me that I had to know what was happening. I had to see it. I wish I hadn't. A figure emerged from the mist so slowly that at first I thought it was just another trick of the fog. A tall man, his figure dark against the swirling white. His posture was strange, bent, like he was dragging something heavy behind him. I could see that his body moved unnaturally, his shoulders hunched, as though whatever he was dragging was far too heavy for him to manage easily. I should have turned and run right then, but my legs wouldn't move. My feet felt like they were trapped in wet cement, and my eyes couldn't look away. As the figure came closer, I saw what he was dragging, a body. A woman, her face pale and twisted in a final expression of terror. Her hair was tangled, matted with blood, and her clothes, what was left of them, were torn and soaked in that awful, sickening red. Her body was limp, lifeless, and her limbs bent in unnatural angles, as though they'd been broken or twisted in some horrific way. The dragging sound was made by her body scraping across the stones. It made my stomach twist in knots. I felt as if the fog itself was closing in around me, suffocating me with its weight. The air grew thick, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure stopped as he reached the center of the street. Slowly, he turned his head in my direction. I couldn't see his face, not clearly. The fog had made his features indistinguishable, a dark hood hiding most of his appearance. But his eyes, those eyes were visible, cold, empty. They didn't hold any warmth, any humanity. They were just black pits, and they locked onto me as though he had been waiting for me. In that moment I knew that this man, the figure, the shadow in the fog, was not like any other. He wasn't just a murderer. He was something darker, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't know how long we stood there staring at each other through the mist. Seconds, minutes, time had stopped. All I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. Then, just as slowly as he had appeared, the figure turned. He dragged the body back into the fog, disappearing as silently as he had come. And just like that, everything went quiet again. I was still frozen, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had witnessed something unthinkable, something evil, but it wasn't over. I knew that. The shadows in the fog were not done. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. The world seemed to be closing in, the streets stretching on forever, the fog suffocating, but somehow I managed to tear my eyes away from the spot where the figure had disappeared. My mind was in a haze, trying to process what I had seen, but nothing made sense. When I finally forced myself to leave, I ran. I ran as if my life depended on it. The streets were a blur, the fog swirling around me like a living thing, threatening to pull me back into its depths. My heart raced in my chest, and every shadow, every movement in the mist made me jump. I was sure that at any moment I would hear those dragging footsteps again. When I reached my home, I locked the door behind me. But the fear didn't leave. It lingered, the smell of blood, the image of the woman's body, those empty, cold eyes staring at me. The next morning, the city was buzzing with whispers. Another woman had been found murdered, discarded in the street. The rumors spread like wildfire. They spoke of the figure, the man in the shadows. Some said he was a phantom. Others called him a demon, but no one knew who he was or where he had come from. All they knew was that he was still out there. And so I stayed up late, night after night, peering out from my window, waiting for something, anything, to move in the fog. My thoughts were consumed by the shadow in the mist, the figure who had looked through me like I wasn't even there. I knew deep in my gut that it wasn't finished, that whatever had started that night, whatever evil had taken root in that fog, wasn't done with me yet. And as the nights grew colder, the fog thicker, I couldn't help but wonder, would I be next?